Hey y'all. Woo! Number 3. And fair warning, this one is a bit longer than the others. So before we get into this, I want to issue a disclaimer of sorts. I'm assuming that this podcast is wildly popular, and most of you guys don't really know me on a personal level. I'm claiming that, by the way. But anyway, if you don't know me, I have my hands in a few things. I work a full-time job, and I'm an author. I'm in the process of writing a couple of things, both related and unrelated to this podcast. I'll shamelessly touch on both of those things at the conclusion of this podcast. I've said all of that as a segue to the disclaimer. My schedule isn't always the most predictable, so I record when timing is opportune. That's why episodes are released on an irregular schedule. I just go with it. At the time of this recording, I was afforded the opportunity to have a little bit more time on my hands, so I went crazy with recording. Afterwards, I listened back and heard some weird glitches. I mean, y'all hear blunders all the time, like me stammering over words and such. But I heard a few sound quality things like echoes and music cutting out, and I was like, the heck happened here? Even during this specific recording, the fall air got in my throat and it was a little bit scratchy. So I had to decide between the lesser of the two evils. I was fortunate to have had some time to record, so I had a lot of audio. Do I toss it and waste the time that it took to record it, or do I just roll with it? I chose to roll because my goal was getting the story out. So if you heard something weird, mind your business. I was on a roll this week, glitching and all. So with that being said, Sidebar with Chinney, number 3. Let's go. I really wanted to do another sidebar prior to this point, but I thought it was important to group all of these chapters together because, in their totality, chapters 12 through 20 encompass an important part of Shelonda's relationship with Ken. But before we get into that, let's revisit something. Our last sidebar covered chapters 6 through 11. If you remember, that was the entire portion of time when Ron was grooming Shelonda. At the end of chapter 11, she was kind of digging Ron to the point that she wondered if her mom and grandma would have had such negative perceptions about men if they had relationships like the one she had with Ron, which is still trippy to me. But anyway, so how did things change so drastically? Well, it really was like the flipping of a switch. But some very specific things had to come into play, and some things had to already exist. First, things changed because Mom came home from the hospital with Cassidy. The entire time while she was in the hospital, Shelonda had begun to feel that she was somewhat in a relationship with Ron. But when Mom came home, the roles changed. Ron was back in parent mode and waiting on Mom hand and foot. It felt awkward. And with the relationship novelty wearing off, Shelonda was able to understand that Ron wasn't being a contributor to the family unit. He didn't work, he didn't assist in the household, and he didn't help take care of Cassidy. She began to see him as less of a man. Shelonda reverted back to her initial feelings about Ron and felt guilty about liking him. 8th grade comes and goes, and now she enters the 9th grade. Chapter 12, Ken. 9th grade, day 1. And she meets Ken purely by the happenstance of their lockers being in close proximity. The meeting of Ken is notable in its own right. I mean, just the way in which Shelonda describes it, you can tell right away that she's very much physically attracted to him. As Shelonda puts it, Ken was so very handsome. He wasn't my typical idea of pretty on paper. He was a little darker. Not as dark as me, but more of the light brown variety. I took a moment to assess his features. Each piece fit together perfectly. He was tall, with an athletic build and beautiful dimples. I was immediately taken aback by his presence, and he smelled so good. That was me, reading in my Shelonda voice, by the way. Man, look, if I was 14, I probably would have been sold on that too. But seriously, we're already aware that Shelonda places a lot of value in the way people look. We learned that when she talked about Monty being pretty on paper. She liked his complexion, his build, and hair texture, even though she admitted that he kinda looked like a baby monkey in the face. Even so, you realize that his general package was enough for her. So of course, the handsome and popular Ken would appeal to her. Happenstance number 2. They share health and PE class. She spends the entire health class on day 1, hoping he'll talk to her, but he doesn't. He finally makes a move on day 2 when she's walking around the track. They have a conversation and she finds that he's easy to talk to. He makes her feel comfortable, which is an anomaly. She's usually shy around guys like Ken. That starts a pattern of them walking and talking every day. Weeks later, Shelonda breaks the rules, which will become a habit, and starts talking to Ken on the phone every night. They become close enough to the point that they share a lot about their lives. Eventually, he decides they're in a relationship. He decides. But at some point, Ken gets into trouble and stops coming to school. Keep in mind that this story takes place in the 90s. So due to the antiquity of the times, she has no point of reference as it relates to finding out what happened to Ken. She basically just has to keep it moving. Meanwhile, she gets out of school for the summer and becomes a full-time caretaker for Cassidy. We find out that Ron is having an affair, which probably shouldn't surprise anybody. But on Cassidy's birthday, he leaves home after an argument with Mom. When he returns, he comes into Shelonda's bedroom. He attempts to kiss and touch on her, but it wasn't gentle like it had been in the past. Ron holds her arms down and tries to forcefully insert his finger inside of her. He tells her that he's glad to see that she's still a virgin. You realize that this is the summer after her 9th grade year, so she's 14. Imagine a grown man doing that at 14, and she wanted to tell it. The unfortunate part of that, well, other than the fact that it happened, is that she mentally references a point in time when a girl from her church told someone that her uncle touched her and nobody believed her. Some people actually accuse the girl of possibly throwing herself at this grown man. With that in mind, Shelonda finds that she'll be better served by keeping it to herself. She starts locking her bedroom door and rides out the rest of the summer. Chapter 13, The Accidental O. Moment of transparency. This chapter was not originally supposed to be silent. I had some house music going and everything. But I got to chapter 15 and realized that I was reading from an unedited version that excluded something very specific that really needed to be included. The exclusion of that one thing would have changed the storyline to such a drastic degree to the point that later references would have been nonsensical. So upon realizing that, I went back and re-recorded chapter 13. I didn't have time to find music to match up and all that because I had already recorded 2 other chapters. I just did a rough read and plugged it in. So, what was the exclusion? It was the Where Do Broken Hearts Go reference. Another moment of transparency. That was never a part of the original storyline. That's why it wasn't included in the unedited version. What you're listening to right now is Book 1 of the Keepsake Box series. It's published in book form under the title Only the Beginning. There are 2 additional books in this trilogy. I wrote all 3 of those books prior to releasing the first one. Days before releasing book 1, I was minding my business, having some drinks, and listening to music. Where Do Broken Hearts Go is my absolute favorite song in real life, so I decided to play it. I was struck with the idea of plugging references to that song into all 3 books. So I just woke up the next day and started doing it. It changed the entire trajectory of the storyline, but I'm so glad I did it. I think it made the story so much more impactful, and obviously, excluding it in chapter 13 would have made a huge difference since it became such a huge part of the story after that point in time. So now that you have that backstory, chapter 13, The Accidental O. Shelonda goes to the 10th grade. It's day 1 again, and here goes Ken. Just like the year before, there's a meeting at the lockers. But this time, they know each other, obviously. I think the way the situation plays out speaks to the nature of both of their personalities. Ken says, "Ain't nothing changed, you're still my girlfriend." And Shelonda just goes with it. She just allows him to make that decision in the same way that she allowed him to decide that they were in a relationship. They pick right back up where they left off, but everything changes because Ken gets a car. And once again, Shelonda allows Ken to make the decision. He tells her that he'll be taking her to and from school. And when she lets him know that it's problematic, he formulates a plan that she goes with. Just like that. It was all pretty innocent at first, until Ken takes Shelonda out to a wooded path and kisses her. And that starts a pattern. Shelonda introduces Ken to Ron's spot in the woods, and they start spending a lot of time together, even skipping school on Wednesdays. During one of those visits, Ken asks Shelonda what her favorite song is. That's when she tells him about Where Do Broken Hearts Go. They listen to it together at some point. I think the part that gets capitalized on is important. I've been around enough to know that dreams don't turn to gold, and that there is no easy way. No, you just can't run away. What we have is so much more than we ever had before. And no matter how I try, you're always on my mind. I'm just messing around. I don't own the rights to that song, and I'm not claiming anything. So don't come for me, Sissy Houston. But the point is, I chose that part for a very specific purpose. They're young, so it's not about them having been around enough to know anything. It's about the fact that you realize how impactful this relationship is to Shelonda. What they have truly is so much more than she's ever had before. And she admits that Ken tends to consume her thoughts. He's always on her mind. And Ken ends up falling in love with the song as well. But off that, let's talk about what really happened in that episode. The accidental O. Goodness. So we all know what that was. And assuredly Ken did too. But can you imagine? Really, I'm picturing it in my mind. They're on the couch just doing their normal innocent thing, when Ken decides to take it a step further. He starts touching and kissing on her. She's good with it. He pulls her over. Now she's straddling him and he's gyrating beneath her. And without the benefit of actual penetration, she has an orgasm, but she had no idea what it was. She's embarrassed, as anybody would be. Can you imagine that? But I think it says a lot about Ken that he didn't make her feel weird about it. But now she wants that shared experience with Ken the next week. And that leads to chapter 14, Unrealistic Expectations. I'm going to assume that we're all adults here so I can speak frankly. I'm not sure when you're going to listen to this, but at the time of this recording, it's 2023. I'm 43. In my 43-year-old mind, I understand very well that 15-year-old girls have no idea what their bodies are supposed to do, and 17-year-old boys are not the best teachers. The hilarity of the situation as a 43-year-old is Shelonda's expectation that lightning was going to strike twice in the same place. Having the simultaneous orgasm expectation between 15 and 17-year-olds was laughable. And it obviously did not work out the way she thought it was going to. However, Shelonda is always in the business of seeing the bright side of things when it comes to Ken. She admits that she was horribly disappointed with the way things turned out. But all of that went out of the window the second Ken made her feel loved afterwards. She even references that as the point in time when she started sacrificing her comfort for the approval of a man. And somewhat along those same lines, I think another important point was made. Ken failed the 10th grade 10 times. Ken failed the 10th grade. Ken did not fail the 10th grade 10 times. Cut. Ken failed the 10th grade 3 times. And even though Shelonda absolutely did not see the benefit of him being a high school dropout, she told him that she supported his decision not to go back to school. I think a breakdown of the aspect of unhealthy relationships is so important because it makes a crucial point. The need is still there for her. Keep in mind that Ron was able to groom Shelonda because he fulfilled a need. She needed to feel loved and pretty at a time when she felt very much less than that. But just because her desire for Ron went away, it doesn't mean that the need went away. Shelonda still needed someone to make her feel worthy. And because Ken fulfilled that need, she was willing to indulge in the unhealthy parts of him as well. She stroked his ego and blindly followed the decisions that he made. She acknowledges that she never made him feel that she was more intelligent than him, even though she felt that he was. And it was all worth it because he fed that thing that she needed. And in a world full of others, he chose her. So now, she's out of school for the summer again. Seems like this girl's always out of school for the summer, but anyway. She's out of school for the summer and doesn't have accessibility to Ken in the same way. Shelonda assumes that all she has to do is meet Ken at the park every day at 3 o'clock. And they'll be able to pick right back up when school starts. Was that unrealistic? I don't know, probably. He's a 17-year-old boy. But anyway, that takes us to chapter 15, Feelings and Fellowship. It's not really a lot to break down in this episode. 1 month into summer break, Shelonda goes to church and just so happens to see a picture of Ken with another girl. I think it's important to note that Shelonda was very much impacted by Melanie saying, if she was doing her job, he wouldn't be coming to me. It's obvious that she internalizes that, which bleeds directly into chapter 16, Planting the Seed. I had a lot of fun with that episode. I liked it because you finally get to see Shelonda stand up for herself a little bit, even though she got talked down. But she started off with some assertion. Shelonda met Ken at the park and blatantly asked him about Melanie. He denied it, which made her angry. But she was even more angry when he admitted it. But then she felt sorry for him because he was crying, as if she wasn't also hurt. Ken explains the situation and plants 3 seeds that end up staying with Shelonda for a very long time. Her takeaway from the situation ends up being 1, a man has needs that must be met. 2, if you don't meet those needs, he'll have to find someone who can. And 3, she starts shaming the other woman because she was easy. She equates Melanie's value to a crutch. He used her until the leg was healed, but she was the leg, thus she was permanent. Those things only served to make Shelonda feel that she had to work hard to make sure that no one else inhabited that space, and Ken, he was just scratching the itch. And then Shelonda did what she always did. She allowed Ken to make the decision. She told him that he had to choose. He cheated. The decision to continue the relationship should have been hers, but she allowed him to choose. And once he did, she made sure to steer the odds in her favor by dropping off an anonymous note to Melanie's parents. I think we see a little bit of that malice start to creep back in. As Shelonda stated, Melanie's parents would probably destroy the picture of her and Ken, which would level the playing field for her. If she didn't have a picture with Ken, Melanie wouldn't have one either. Chapter 17, I have questions. I don't like the chapter. Obviously, the subject matter is a bit rough, but I also hate the turn that Ken and Shelonda's relationship starts to take. Because Shelonda wanted to make sure that Ken didn't have a reason to cheat, she kept her promise to make sure they could have sex. She starts sneaking out of the house and also sneaking him in. Ken starts incrementally inserting himself more and more. Initially, he just asks for more time when he sees her at the park. Then he starts showing up and knocking on the window. Eventually, it gets to the point that he asks her to just leave the window unlocked so he could just come in. Shelonda doesn't think so at the time, but it was absolutely too much. Assuredly, the joke about her not ever knowing when he was going to pop up was laced with quite a bit of truth. But it made Shelonda feel loved and wanted. The summer ends, and Shelonda assumes that they'll be going back to their regular Wednesday schedule. She locks her window and goes to sleep. Ken shows up at 1 a.m., angry that her window's locked. Then he proceeds to rape her in her bathroom. He didn't even say anything afterwards. He just left right back out of the window. In an excerpt from that chapter, Shelonda says, and I quote, "I was 16. As a teen, I committed that moment to memory as the first time that Ken and I had unprotected sex and the first time I had oral sex. Now, as an adult, I reference it as the first time I got raped. At the time, I didn't think of it as rape. It was inconceivable to me that you could be raped by someone who you would willingly have had sex with otherwise. Now I know that's not true. That was, indeed, the first time I had unprotected sex and the first time I had oral sex. But it was also the first time I was raped. It wouldn't be the last time for either. I felt used and dirty, yet I still didn't equate the experience to rape. It was just an unfortunate and uncomfortable situation in my mind, but not rape." And then she explains how everything changed for Ken, but nothing changed for her. Ken understood that he could take things too far and she'd be silent. That's what changed for him. But she still felt the same about him, so nothing changed for her. All she wanted was an apology and to ask some questions, and that was problematic. As roundabout as it sounds, a question is an answer. I can't speak for anyone else, but when I'm done, I'm done. If I know I'm doing the right thing, I'm not going to ask any questions because I don't want to give you an opportunity to possibly change my mind. The desire to ask questions says, if you offer a reasonable explanation, I might forgive you. But that's just me. After what happened that night, Shelonda shouldn't even have given him the opportunity to explain. Her self-preservation should have mandated that she just walk away, but she didn't. So that leads to chapter 18, Box of Promises. Ken and Shelonda meet the next day. He cries again and apologizes. Shelonda feels bad about seeing him cry again. She even tells him to get off of his knees because she feels that he's demeaning himself. Ken tells Shelonda about his life's hardships, and she completely disregards what he did to her to address what's going on with him. He tells her that he had too much to drink and smoked some marijuana. That allowed her to see the situation as an isolated incident. He quotes "Where do broken hearts go?" and she folds like origami. Ken spends the day catering to Shelonda and making her feel special. She even says that she feels lucky to have him. He pulls out a Polaroid and takes some pictures of them to even things out a little bit. Remember that Shelonda was angry about the fact that Melanie had a picture with Ken and she didn't. The keepsake box is also introduced in chapter 18. Ken gives it to Shelonda to keep things inside. The title of the entire series is the keepsake box, so I'm pretty sure you know the box is going to come into play in a major way. Ken gives Shelonda a promise ring. It's not a promise ring in the typical sense as it relates to purity. It's a promise to love and protect her forever, a promise that ends up coming back to bite both of them, which leads to chapter 19, Can't Hide. To that point, Shelonda had been very selective with what she had chosen to share with Ken, but it was difficult to keep things in the figurative box when she ran to his car after obviously having been attacked. So now the cat's out of the bag. Well, initially, she gives an abbreviated story about the emotional and physical abuse, but she eventually confesses to everything. Now, as the person who wrote all of this, hindsight makes me ask, do other people feel that Ken was justified in his level of anger? I mean, on the one hand, Shelonda was his girl, so any trespass against her was a trespass against him as well. Anybody who really loves somebody is going to hurt by them being hurt. But on the other side, Ken had seriously violated Shelonda on his own accord. I don't know. If I were Shelonda, I might have found his anger to be slightly contradictory. Like, you violated me too, even more so. But I guess that goes back to Shelonda's justification of it all. She didn't feel like Ken raped her, and she felt that it was an isolated incident based on where he was in life at the time. But Ron, he was a real-life predator in her eyes, so I guess I can understand why she was able to differentiate between the two. Either way, Ken gives Shelonda some pain medication and she goes to sleep. She awakens hours later to an empty house. Ken returns and finds Shelonda cooking dinner. To his dismay, she states her intention to go back home. She has to. She's only 16, and she would never be allowed to move out. Ken tells Shelonda that she's always welcome there, and she goes home. At some point, Ron, Mom, and Cassidy arrive, and she realizes that Ron has been attacked. Mom gets sick at dinner, reminding Shelonda that she's pregnant. Shelonda spends all night paging Ken to tell him about Ron. He never calls back. Chapter 20, Somebody Has to Pay. Now, we all know why Ken didn't call back, and Shelonda cannot be that dumb. But to her credit, she did say that she had an idea, but she just didn't want to believe it. The episode starts with Shelonda going to the bus stop with a sense of dread that Ken wasn't going to be there to pick her up. It's crazy that she was 16 at that point, yet she understood that she had nothing in common with kids her age. Between having to basically be a full-time caretaker at home and having an adult relationship with Ken, Shelonda didn't know how to be a child. She watched children her age do exactly what they were supposed to do, and it felt childish to her. Fast forward to January, and Ron makes Shelonda skip school for the day. She has a bad feeling about it, but she understands that she can't say no. He drives her to a court building where she realizes that he has basically set her up to watch Ken get sentenced for his attack. But things don't go Ron's way because Ken has already taken a deal, and the court appearance is merely a formality to accept that deal. Shelonda feels that she has beaten Ron at the game, but she gets a rude awakening when Ron comes into her bedroom after court. He tells her that he has known who attacked him the whole time, and because Ken didn't do the best job at covering his tracks. And because he feels that she was in some way complicit, he feels that they must both pay. How will they both pay? Well, Ron brutally raped Shelonda, which he feels will be a get back for both of them. Not only does he rape her, but he spits in her face, which is demeaning enough on its own. Afterwards, he tells Mom that Shelonda got into a fight at school to account for the fact that he punched her in the face. Shelonda doesn't discredit his account. The next day, he beats her severely because the rape cued him into the fact that she wasn't a virgin, and that deserves some disciplinary action. So now we're all caught up. I'm not going to tell y'all the title of the next episode because the title alone drops a bomb. But from this point, Ken is locked up, so Shelonda is out there all alone. What does that mean for her? We'll catch up on the next Sidebar with Chinney. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Chinney Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon. I sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome.